Today we're starting with our introduction to the skeletal system. The skeletal system does take several weeks for us to go over. The first section we're going to go over is going to be the notes on how the tissue forms. Then we're going to go over the appendicular skeleton and axial skeleton separately in their own sections. So starting out today with the skeletal system, the human skeleton initially is going to be started out as cartilage and fibrous membranes. So bone does not form first in the womb. The first thing that starts to form is going to be the fibrous membranes and the cartilage, which will convert over into bone. By the age of 25, your skeleton is going to be completely hardened. So it can change in its makeup, but it's not going to change in length. So you're going to do all of your growing before the age or by the age of 25. At that point, your skeleton's going to be complete. Now, depending on how you walk, depending on, for example, that's your gait, depending on different things that you do, if you exercise, if you run, if you lift weights, that can actually change the structure of that bone. It could get wider and have more girth to it. If you break it, you could have a bony callus and it be thicker in a certain part, but it's not going to change in length. So width, yes, it can. Length, no, it's not going to. By the age of 25, it is complete. Now, in the human adult skeleton, you're going to have 206 bones. That's going to make up 20% of your body mass. With those bones, you can divide them up into two different skeletal sections that we talked about just a minute ago. The axial skeleton is going to contain 80 bones, and then you have 126 bones that are going to be part of your appendicular skeleton. The functions of the skeletal system, mainly, number one is for support. It helps give your body shape, give your body structure, and protect things. And so it could be, for example, your thoracic cavity can enclose around, or the thoracic cage can enclose around the thoracic cavity, which then is going to protect the lungs and the heart that's going to be there. Also, some major vessels that are going to run through the posterior part. It's going to help with movement because it's going to provide leverage for muscles. Some muscles are going to attach to those bones using tendons. Bones will attach to bones using ligaments. That's going to be something important that you need to know. Tendons attach muscle to bone. Ligaments attach bone to bone. It's also going to be very important in blood cell production. Now, this isn't just going to be red blood cells. It's going to consist of white blood cells as well as lymphatic cells and platelets and the other components of blood, such as the matrix, which is the plasma. And so that's going to actually be produced in the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow, depending on the bone, is usually going to be found in the spongy bone. However, in small children and infants, it can be found in the long bone section until it goes to the ends at the spongy section. It's going to be very important in mineral homeostasis. It's going to have collagenous fibers, which are going to help make up the structure, but laid down on those collagenous fibers is going to be calcium and phosphate. And so that calcium and phosphorus or phosphate salts, which get laid down and create the hard part of the bone, which you would consider to be the bone, is going to be made up of these minerals. So basically, if you have any excess of these minerals in your diet, they get laid out onto your bone, makes your bone stronger. If you, however, need any of these minerals, then you're going to learn later on that we're going to have cells that come along and they will eat away at that bone and release these minerals into the bloodstream so you're able to have them for different things that you might need in your body. Another thing is going to be triglyceride storage. And you learned from the previous chapters that we've talked about that triglycerides are going to be fat or adipose. And so we're going to find triglyceride storage mainly in the medullary cavity of the long part or the shaft of the bone. So looking at this picture, you see the skeleton. In this orangey color, you're going to find the axial skeleton. That's going to consist of things like the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cavity. With the bone-colored, that's going to be the appendicular skeleton. So that's going to consist of what we call the pectoral girdle. And hold on just a moment and I'll circle that for you. So the pectoral girdle, that's going to consist of the collarbone, which is here, the clavicle, and it consists of the scapula, which is around back. That's referred to as the pectoral girdle. It also consists of the upper appendages, the arms, the wrist, and the hands. And then it consists of the pelvic girdle, which is going to be made up of these coxa. Each one's a coxa. And that is then going to be attached to the leg bones. And then we'll go over the ankles and the feet bones. Other things that you'll see on here are going to be things like the different cartilages that we talked about in the last chapter with histology. So you have your hyaline cartilage there in blue. You see some elastic cartilage like up here on the ear. And then you see the fibro cartilage, which is going to be in the center here at that symphysis pubis, or depending on what book you're using, it might say pubic symphysis. Either one, same thing. It just depends on what text you're using. So bone and osseous tissue. Bone is going to be a connective tissue that's made from a framework, like we said, of collagen fibers with a hardened matrix. And that hardened matrix is going to be the calcium and phosphorus. So that calcium phosphate is going to be how it's found, and calcium hydroxide are going to interact together with each other, and then they're going to crystallize. And when they crystallize, they're going to form hydroxyapatite. The hydroxyapatite crystals are going to be incorporated into that calcium carbonate, sodium ions, magnesium ions, and fluoride in order to make up the hard structure of the bone. So mainly, remember that hydroxyapatite. Now with the bone, if you were to soak bone in an acid, it's going to eat away at that hard matrix of that hydroxyapatite, and it's going to leave behind those collagenous fibers. And so that collagen is going to be it's strong, but it's also very flexible. And so you see here, these bones have been soaked in acid. And what you see is that they're very flexible. They're able to bend because they've gotten rid of the hard matrix and only left behind those collagen fibers. So with these collagen fibers, we know from previous chapters that collagen is actually made from protein. So you do have a lot of this protein that's going to be found in your bones. Now moving over to bone cells. There's several different types of cells that we're going to find within the bone. The osteogenic cells are going to be the stem cells of bone, so they can make up the others. They often are referred to as osteoprogenitor cells. Then you have your osteoblasts. With the osteoblasts, they're going to be referred to as matrix synthesizing cells. So they're responsible for bone growth. When they synthesize, that means they produce. So these are the ones that are going to be laying down the matrix or laying down those hydroxyapatite, that calcium phosphate salts onto those collagen fibers. The osteocytes here are going to be mature bone cells. With the mature bone cells, you're going to find these in the lacunae of the actual hardened section of the bone. These are going to maintain the health of that bone, and they're going to live in that bone as a mature cell. And then you have your osteoclasts. Now with these osteoclasts, they're going to be called the bone reabsorbing cells. What they're going to do is they're going to run along the inside of the bone, and they're going to secrete a substance that's going to break down this bone. They're very important in being able to put the calcium and phosphates that you might need back into the bloodstream, but they're also going to be important in remodeling bone. So you're going to use this in order to reshape and remodel bone as you walk, as you exercise, and if you ever had a break, it's going to help remodel that bone so it is structurally good again. So looking inside of these bone structures here, it's going to show you at the top, you see that medullary cavity. That's going to be the inside part of the bone here. And so that's this section here on the inside. So you see that osteogenic cell. That cell, remember, is going to be your stem cell. So it's going to give rise to other types of cells. You have what goes around the inside there, which is going to be referred to as the endosteum. That's going to help maintain the inside portion of that bone. Coming on down, you have the osteocyte. which is going to be this cell right here. It's going to have the main cell body, which I just circled. It has a nucleus inside. Then it's going to have these cytoplasmic projections that come out to the side. Those are referred to as the canaliculi. And so those will be able to attach to other bone cells. You can kind of see that other bone cell right up through here. And so that's going to attach in there. Ooh. And when it does that, they're able to connect to each other and send nutrients. They can send different things back and forth, or just chemical signals back and forth. Now going to the next one, you have your osteoblasts. These are going to be the bone building cells. So they are immature bone cells. What they do is they secrete that organic matrix that's going to go along those collagen fibers, and that's what's going to harden and become the hard part of the bone. And so you see these osteoblasts through here. You're going to have a matrix, which is going to go through the center. The osteoid, which is going to go through the center. And I'm circling the wrong thing. The matrix, which is going to be on the inside there. And then coming down to the bottom. This medullary cavity, like we said, is going to be this opening in the center. So that's what you see here, all of this opening here. And running along the inside of that bone, you're going to see that osteoclast. So that osteoclast is eating away at this hardened matrix right here. So it's eating away at that. As it eats away at it, it's going to release calcium and phosphate into the bloodstream. But it can also do that to help remodel that bone. So it's going to build it from the outer portion up here. And so this is going to be the outer portion of the bone. But it's going to eat away at it on the inner portion of the bone. So looking here, this is going to be the average picture of what we refer to as a long bone. This one here is the humerus, or the arm bone, the upper arm bone. It's going to be made up of several different parts, and you'll need to know these different parts. The ends are going to be referred to as the epiphysis. So we have an epiphysis. Sorry, didn't turn on my drawing. Give it a minute. So the epiphysis is on the top, and you have an epiphysis on the bottom. Now, proximal epiphysis, because it's closer to the trunk of the body. Distal epiphysis, because it's further away from the trunk of the body. If you put the two together, they're referred to as epiphyses. So we have proximal and then distal epiphysis. Now, the in-between section before you get to the center is called the metaphysis, and that's going to be this section here. And so this section right here, kind of where it starts to go from being bigger down to being thinner. And so that's your metaphysis, or metaphyses. That's a mouthful. Then you actually get into the long bone section here, which is referred to as the diaphysis. Or if you're talking about multiple ones, it's diaphyses. And so know those sections there. Now, looking at the end, notice that going around this epiphysis, you're going to have articular cartilage. It's called articular cartilage because this is where bones are going to articulate with each other or come together with each other. And so, therefore, the cartilage that goes over the end is an articular cartilage. Underneath that, you are going to find, it's hard to see and they don't have it listed right here, but you'll notice this compact bone here. Notice how it comes up around the entire bone, and it travels throughout the entire bone. So you're going to have a very thin layer of compact bone before you come into the center portion here where it's spongy bone. And so that spongy bone is where we're going to find that red bone marrow. Remember, that's where we're going to make our red blood cells, white blood cells, all the lymphocytes, and the plasma, the platelets, and things like that. So it's all going to be made there in the spongy bone. Next, you'll see what's referred to as the epiphyseal line. It's not always called the epiphyseal line. If you're still growing, that is going to be your growth plate. So it might be referred to as the epiphyseal plate. When you look at a bone, and if it still says that it's an epiphyseal plate or a growth plate, you know that that bone belongs to someone who has not finished growing. If it's turned over into a line, then that person or that bone has finished growing. And so it's a mature bone. Now, when it's a line, it's going to be made up of cartilage, and that allows it to keep extending and lengthening itself. Once it turns over into an epiphyseal line, it's going to completely change over and calcify and become hardened bone. Coming on down, you're going to see the inside covering there. It's a very, very thin, almost see-through type covering that you'll find inside of the bone. That's referred to as the endosteum. That's going to line that medullary cavity. Inside also, you're going to find things like nutrient arteries, which are going to be there to feed those osteocytes, the osteoclast, osteoblast, all that bone there. Also within that medullary cavity, remember you're going to have your yellow bone marrow, and that yellow bone marrow is going to be there for fats, or basically adipose tissue stored inside, triglycerides. On the outside of the bone, notice it's also going to be wrapped in a very thin layer of protection, and that's referred to as the periosteum. And so that's going to go around, and it kind of keeps the arteries and veins and things attached to the inside of the bone and to the outside of the bone, as well to help protect it. So with that long bone structure, we just looked at the diaphysis. That's going to be referred to as a tubular shaft that forms along axis. It's mainly made up of compact bones surrounding that medullary cavity. You have the epiphyses, which are going to be both ends of the bone. Its external portion, like I showed you, is going to be made up of compact bone, with the internal portion made up of that spongy bone. It's also going to have a thin layer of articular cartilage that's going to cover the surface, and that is a hyaline cartilage. The metaphysis or metaphyses are going to be between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So that's kind of that middle section. Remember where it's going from a thicker section down to a tapered, thinner section. And then that epiphyseal line is the line between the diaphysis and the epiphyses, and is a remnant of, like I said, your childhood bone growth or the epiphyseal plate. But once it's hardened and turned into a line, that bone will no longer grow. Sometimes you can damage the growth plate, and it will cause that epiphyseal line to go ahead and calcify, and it'll keep that bone from growing. So it could stunt the growth of that bone. Right, the periosteum is going to cover the external surface of the entire bone except for the joint surfaces. Now the outer layer of dense connective tissue is going to have an inner layer that consists of primarily osteogenic cells. And so remember, those are going to be your stem cells. Also, like I said, you're going to find your blood vessels that are going to be inside there, and it's going to help keep nerve fibers against the bone. Within this layer, it's going to have what's referred to as perforating fibers or Sharpey's fibers. And these are going to be collagen fibers that are going to secure that periosteum to the underlying bone. So it gives it strength, and it helps attach it to that bone, almost like it's wrapping it around, or it's gluing it onto the actual bone. Next, you have that medullary cavity. That's the hollow space within the diaphysis. We said that holds yellow marrow and blood vessels, as well as nerves. The endosteum is going to be connective tissue that's going to cover the internal bone surface, so that medullary cavity, and it contains osteogenic cells as well. It's going to help cover also the trabeculae of spongy bone, and it's going to line the canals of compact bone. Now, that's one thing that we haven't talked about yet. We'll look at a closer picture of spongy bone in a little bit, but the different parts that actually make it basically what is referred to as its name, spongy looking, all those little different sections or pieces are going to be referred to as trabeculae. So here's that picture I was talking about. And so each one of these little branches here, it's got open space around it. All of that is the trabeculae. And so it's going to help line and protect that, as well as line and protect all these little circular canals that you see coming through the compact bone. So we just looked at this, basically the bigger picture of that long bone. Here it is, they put that yellow bone marrow in there. They are showing you how that nutrient artery is kind of weaving through. If you look closer over to this picture here, you can see all these different fibers going through. Those are the perforating fibers or the Sharpey's fibers. With the compact bone, you're going to notice it has a very distinct structure. That structure is going to be a bunch of basically circles. And those circles, when you look at them underneath a microscope, or if you see them in a picture, you know right away that is going to be a picture of compact bone. And so with that compact bone, it has that very distinct look to it. And we're going to look at that a little bit closer too. Now looking closer into this long bone, you see how the different epiphyseal arteries and veins are going to run through the epiphysis. Then you can see that epiphyseal line. We know that this is a mature bone because it's not cartilage. It's not referred to as a growth plate. Then you see the metaphyseal artery and vein. And so that's going in to feed the metaphysis. And then you see how it's actually coming in through that medullary cavity. And you see how it fed into that medullary cavity. Hold on. Here. So it started out as part of that periosteal artery and vein. It's going to feed through these little holes that are in bone and then intertwine themselves through the inside up through different parts of the bone. Now, these little holes that they're going to wind themselves through, like you find right here, any hole in a bone is going to be referred to as a foramen. And so that's going to be referred to as the nutrient foramen because it's allowing nutrient arteries and veins to wind in and out of the bone. So you need to see another one right there, a larger one. Here's a picture of an actual bone that has been cleaned and dried out. And so you can see that spongy bone really well. You can see the compact bone really well. You can see that proximal end, the epiphyseal line, and the metaphysis. One thing that you cannot see on here is you don't see any cartilage. That cartilage has been cleaned away or it's no longer on this bone. Looking at some of the bone that you might find in places like the skull or in flat bones, you'll notice that it's going to have compact bone on the top and on the bottom. And through the center, you're going to have what's referred to as the spongy bone. Now, one thing that you might want to make note of, spongy bone in some text is referred to as cancellous bone. And so if you see that, know that they're just simply talking about spongy bone. So with the compact bone, you're going to have those circular shapes that we just kind of talked about. We're going to look at them a little bit closer. Those are referred to as the osteons. Each one of those circles is an osteon, and it's going to consist of several different things inside, and that's going to make up what's known as the Haversian system. So it's a structural unit. It's elongated cylinder that's going to be parallel to long axis of the bone. It's going to have a series of concentric tubes of bone matrix, referred to as the lamellae, and it's surrounding a central Haversian canal. It's going to serve as a passageway for blood vessels and for nerves to come in and out of the bone. The lamellae is simply going to be a section that's going to be just beneath the periosteum. It's going to extend around the entire circumference of the bone. So it's kind of like a tree, has different circles around it. This osteon is going to be made up of different circles, and each one of those circles is called a lamellae. And so you can have circumferential lamellae. You can have the interstitial lamellae. So the ones that are going to go around the entire circumference of the bone are those circumferential lamellae. The interstitial are going to lie between intact osteons, and they're going to fill in the spaces between them there. Next, you're going to have what's referred to as the perforating canal or the Volkmann's canal. It's going to lie at the right angle to the long axis of the bone. This is going to help connect blood and nerve supply to the periosteum and central canals and the medullary cavity. The lacunae is simply going to be the hole or the opening where you're going to find that cell. So these are small holes that will house the osteocytes. Remember, your osteocytes are going to be your mature bone cell. They're found at junctions of lamellae. They're going to connect each other to the central canal through a series of hair-like channels. And remember, those hair-like channels we refer to as canaliculi. And so when you put that osteocyte into that opening or lacunae, they're going to have their cytoplasmic extensions, which can extend through these small channels. And that way they can connect to other cells around them. And they can send messages back and forth. They can send nutrients and things back and forth, and waste products, things that might need to go from one spot to another. And so they're going to travel through these cytoplasmic extensions, which are going to be found in the canaliculi. And so here's a picture of what we just talked about. So remember, you're going to have the central canal, also referred to as the Haversian canal. And so that's going to be the center opening here. That's your central canal. The sideways openings here, these are your Volkmann's canals, or your perforating canals. And so Haversian going up, Volkmann going across. Yeah, each one of these little circles, let's do this one. So we have a circle, then you have another circle, and you see each one of those circles. Each circle is going to be a lamellae. And so you have the ones going around each osteon, or you have the ones going around the entire section of this bone here. So the ones that go around the entire section are going to be the circumferential. And then you have your other ones, which are going to be the concentric lamellae that are going around the circles here, like circles on a tree. Now, inside, you have those openings where you're going to find the osteocytes. And so those osteocytes are going to be that pinkish color little, the pinkish color little cells that you're going to find throughout here. And so the opening that holds the cell is going to be the lacunae. The osteocyte is going to be the cell that's actually inside. And then each circular section, for example, this whole circle here, is going to be referred to as an osteon. This whole circle here is referred to as an osteon. This whole circle section there is referred to as an osteon. So all of those made up of a bunch of osteons, circular systems within that bone. And here's a different picture looking at it. It shows you how each one of those osteocytes is going to have its canaliculi. And you'll see these traveling through here. That way they can connect to other cells. You notice it has a cell body, which is going to be the main part of the cell. It's going to have a nucleus inside there. The opening that cell's found in, so you see this open space kind of around that it's found in, that's the lacunae. Looking closer, you can actually see that this is going to actually be made up of different layers. You have the outer fibrous layer, and then you're going to have the inner osteogenic layer. And so that shows you the two layers that are going to be found in that periosteum. Also, over here, you see these different trabeculae coming out. You see the inner circumferential lamellae. You're going to see the concentric lamellae that are going to be found going around each one of these osteons here. And then you see how the different nutrient arteries and veins are going to be able to connect through the different canals, whether it's the Volkmann's or the Haversian canals. Here, looking again at the inside of the bone, it shows you just a different view. And so this is going to be a chunk that's taken out. So inside, you see that periosteum. You're going to see the actual cellular level where you're going to find those osteogenic cells. You see this fibrous layer, which is on the outer portion of it. You're going to see the osteocytes, which are going to be found here. You see all the different lines running through. Those are all the canaliculi that are going through there. And so with these, Look at these collagen fibers. Notice how they all don't go the same way. With the collagen fibers, they're always going to go against each other. The reason that they do this is because it's going to make them structurally sound and very strong. And so this is going to give the bone not only a rigidity to it or the ability to be tough and strong, it also allows for some flexibility in that bone. So it won't snap if you go to, let's say, jump off a ledge or jump from a high surface. It does have some give, which will help cushion and help it rebound. Here, you're looking into the inside part of an actual bone. You see that spongy section, and you see that compact section. Going into spongy bone, it's going to be poorly organized. You're not going to have those osteons there that are making it look very orderly. Here, instead, you're going to have what's referred to as trabeculae. They're going to line along lines of stress to help that bone resist the stress that it's being put on. It's not going to have osteons present inside of the spongy bone. It's going to contain irregularly arranged lamellae. Osteocytes are going to be interconnected by the canaliculi there. That's going to be around that hard bone, which is usually on the outside of the spongy bone. Also, you're going to have capillaries in that endosteum that are going to supply the nutrients there. So coming from within, that's where that endosteum is. And so looking here, you see the space or the opening there. That's where we're going to find that red bone marrow that's going through the creation of different types of red blood cells, white blood cells, and everything that we need for blood. You see the osteocyte that's going to be working its way into the different openings of the lacunae. You see those canaliculi, which are going to be found on the edge there. You see the lamellae, or the different circles, so that's going to be right on the edge, and then within you have all those trabeculae. And so here is another picture here, and it shows the inside, and so how those trabeculae are made up of. Again, you have the lamellae going through the center. You're going to have those osteocytes that are made up within. And so even though they kind of look like that compact bone, they're still going to have some of the same structure. These are what are going to be made up in that trabeculae. And so they're going to go every which ways, kind of bend and turn and leave all those open spaces, but they're still going to have some of the same features. So hematopoietic tissue and bones is going to be that red bone marrow. It's going to be found, like we said, within the trabecular cavities of the spongy and long dipoli of the flat bones. In infants, it's actually going to be found, like I said, in the medullary cavity and areas of spongy bone. It's not until they're older that it actually turns over into adipose tissue or a yellow bone marrow. Adults, it's going to be restricted to flat bones and to proximal epiphysis of the humerus and the femur. Now, with that, let's say you were to get into an accident or lost a lot of blood. Let's say you cut something, you were stabbed, something like that drastic happened, and you lose a lot of blood. Your body's actually able to take that medullary cavity, change that yellow bone marrow over to red bone marrow. Once it gets your blood supply back up, then it can convert itself back over to yellow bone marrow. So this is something that's pretty neat or pretty cool about the medullary cavity and that yellow bone marrow and red bone marrow. As an infant, it's red bone marrow, converts as they grow older, it converts over into yellow bone marrow. But if you are in an accident, or if you, let's say you just gave a lot of blood, you donated a lot of blood and your body has to get that blood supply back up, it can convert that yellow marrow back over to red bone marrow and get your blood supply back up. All right, I'm going to stop right there, so that'll end us for our first section of notes. We'll have several sections in this unit.